So all we should be left with now is our column, and I always underscore MSH for those so I know it's a mesh. Okay, let's save all so that we don't lose anything we've already done. And let's jump back into Max. Alright. We've done that column. Let's work on these pieces here. Now these are wooden pieces that go above the doorways actually. These are like a door jamb that sits above the doorway, so that the front door and side doors will be sitting underneath of these, and this is just a decorative piece that sits above it. So again, we have the ceiling that touches the top and two side walls either side, so we really only have to worry about the bottom and the front. But we do want to change the colour a little bit as well. Before we do that, let's make sure that our mesh is actually the verts aren't split on it. So again, I'm going to go and do sub-object mode and select them, and they look okay, so that's good. Let's find the texture that we're using for that. Now it looks like I'm reusing the same texture I used for the featured column, and you'll notice I'll do, particularly for game models, I do that quite a bit. Whenever I can reuse a texture for an asset, I will. So basically this model is using this part of the texture here. Hey Nano, how's things? Good to see you as well. Thanks for popping in and saying hello. I hope you guys had a good weekend. Yeah, so wherever I can, I like to reuse the texture on a game model. Again, it reduces the memory count for the game engine and for the graphics card, which will just help speed up your game engine a bit. So we've reused the bottom half of this texture here that we're using for the column on these pieces that go along the top of the doorway. What about Control S? You're talking about saving a file. Yeah, you guys, as I've explained, I don't like to use shortcuts or macros while I'm working on stream, simply because I can find I don't have an on-screen keyboard to show you what keys I'm pressing, and I know saving a file is saving a file, but like I said, you'll notice when I work in Max, instead of using a macro or a shortcut on my mouse here, a button on my mouse, I'll actually go and move my mouse all around the screen. I do that for the benefit of you guys, so that you can see what I'm doing when I'm doing it. It's less confusing. I've noticed if you're watching somebody work and they're using a lot of macros or shortcuts or keyboard shortcuts, it can get confusing sometimes as to what they're doing when they're doing it. So that's the reason you won't see me using Control S or too much. I use Control C to copy, but if I do that, I tell you. And when I'm working in Max, you'll see me moving my mouse all over the screen to hit different buttons, as opposed to using a shortcut key or a macro. That's the reason I do that. So we have our asset here using the same texture as our column. Let's export our asset, but before we do that, let's make sure we do a reset export. Collapse our stack. And we're calling this one, let's feature column, we'll call this one feature door top. That'll do. As long as you know what it means, and that's all that matters. Let's export that. So export selected, and again I'm going to put it in its own folder though, so that I can find everything again much more easily later on. And call it feature door top, save it as an FBX. Let's jump into Unreal and import that model. We'll see if it's if the normals need to be flipped on it or not. Let's give Unreal a second here to compile the texture, the shader. Nano's asking, are you working with the roughness metallic workflow on Substance Painter? Or if I'm using the gloss? If I'm working in Substance Painter, I am using the roughness metallic workflow, Nano, yep. If I'm working in Null to do my texturing, then I'm just working with a spec if I need a spec. But anything I create in Substance Painter, I do use a roughness and metallic map. Let me just jump into my materials here. Let me just check to make sure my normals are okay and they look alright. If I jump into my materials here, Nano, and I open up one of the materials I've used that I've painted up in Substance. Let's look at this one. You'll see that I am using a metallic and a roughness on the material I export from Substance Painter. This is the material using the UE4 template in Substance Painter. What it does is it puts the roughness, the metallic and the ambient occlusion in one texture sample. Again, it does that to save memory. So you'll either do it that way if you're using the preset that comes in Substance for the Unreal Engine. Like they have templates for UE4 and that type of thing. It'll spit out one texture that you'll have for your roughness, metallic and occlusion. So I generally will work that way. But on one or two models I have used just the PBR template from Substance Painter, in which case it'll spit out different textures for your ambient occlusion, metallic and roughness. So this is not an ideal way to do it because again, you're using 3 texture samples here, so more memory, as opposed to the other way where it just uses one texture sample to hold all those 3 different maps. So if you're just using the Substance Painter template that's for physically based materials, it's going to spit out these 3 different maps, which is fine. You can still pipe them into Unreal here in your material. But the better way to do it is to actually use the UE4 template in Substance Painter, in which case it will only spit out one texture that you can then pipe into the 3 different slots. And that's a better way to do it because you're using less memory. You're only using one texture sample. Either way will work, but this is the better way to do it. Because like I said, it's always good to use the least amount of memory as possible in a game's engine. You want to make sure that your graphics card has as much memory available to it as it can, and it has less textures to load into memory to create your model if you're using one texture as opposed to 3 separate ones. Again, that was why we created multi-materials when we made this banister section. We did that so that we reduced the number of draw calls on the asset. So if we used all different multiple textures, we're increasing our draw call, which slows the engine down. So by using a multi-material ID map to texture up our model in Substance Painter, we reduce the amount of draw calls, which reduces the load on the engine and on the graphics card. Let's make sure, you'll notice when I pulled in that new asset we just created, that top of the door jam thing, Unreal created a new material for it. Now that's unnecessary because we already have a material created for it. So I'm going to open up that mesh and jump into my materials here. Find the material we already created for that asset, which is this one here, this feature column material. I'm just going to drag that into my slot so it uses the same material. There's no point in recreating another material that's exactly the same. And that means we can delete these 2 that it pulled in by default. Same with the texture, we've already got the texture in memory, so we can delete this one. And like I was saying, our color is right because we're using the same texture we use for the column, so that's fine. Let's make sure we rename our asset here so we don't get confused. Our feature column top, and I always like to do an underscore MSH for mesh, for my mesh assets. Again, that just keeps everything nice and organized here for me. Alright, let's save our file. Let's jump back into Max and look for something else now. So we're getting through a few of the assets here pretty quickly because I don't have to change much on them. Alright, we have these window jams now. Now these are the pieces that go over the curtain inside the building. So I can just, basically the curtains sit in here and this butts up against the wall of where the window sits. So the window sits in here. And this just sits above the curtains. It's like a, I forget exactly what the name of it is now, but yeah, it's just a piece that sits above the curtains. So the curtains sit inside there. Again though, let's check to make sure that our verts aren't split. So I'm going to go into sub-object mode, and you can see here, we may be okay. No, I think we're alright. I was going to say it looked like it was split, but I think it's okay. We'll know if it's split or not when we bring it into the engine. It will won't light correctly. We're going to call this one, I really have to remember the name of it. What's it called? Curtain, we'll call it Curtain Runner. It's not actually what it's called. The actual name escapes me at the moment, but we'll call it Curtain Runner. Again though, let's make sure we do a reset X form on this and collapse our stack. And let's, again, it's using the same texture as the column, so we're reusing the texture as much as we can when we can. We'll export selected, make sure we create our new folder for it, and we'll export it. And again, for anyone that just may be popping in to check the channel, all I have selected on my export for Unreal is smoothing groups, triangulate and preserve edge orientation. Let's jump back into Unreal and import that asset. Here we go. Again too, if you're not exporting your model at 000 world position in your 3D program, make sure that you have this transform vertex to absolute unticked. When you first install Unreal, that will be ticked by default, and what that will do is every time you import your asset, if your asset is not at 000 world position, your axes will be off. So it'll put your axes at 000 but place your model over here, wherever it is in your 3D program. If you don't want that and you want your axes to be centered to your model, make sure you turn off transform vertex to absolute during the import here. Again, I'm going to give Unreal a minute to compile the shader. Open up my asset. And again, the normals look okay on this. The texture looks alright, so that should be fine. But we do want to swap out the material because we don't want it to create this new material every time we bring a new asset in. So again, I'm going to open the asset, jump into my materials, and drag that featured column material into my material slot here. Make sure we save. Back into my models, and now I can delete the two default materials that the engine created. And I want to rename that curtain runner to underscore MSH so that I know it's a mesh. And make sure we save our file again. Alright, let's just going to delete that column there. Alright, let's jump back into Max. I might look at this here, I think, actually, this asset here. Now, this is a piece that runs along the top of the ceiling. It's like a border section between, I think from memory it sits underneath of the wrought iron gates that are inside the building on the upper floor. And this is just a decorative piece that sits along the top of the ceiling to separate the, let's look at the video. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. It separates the middle section of that upper floor from the side sections. I'm just going to skip through here until I get to that part of the building. Okay. You can just see it here. Yeah, it sits along the top of the ceiling to separate the middle part of the room from the two side parts of the room where this decorative ironwork sit. I'm just waiting to see if we can get another look at it somewhere here. And you can see where the columns are sitting inside the room here as well. And there it is there. It's sitting along the top of the ceiling here. It sits above these wooden arched pieces that go in the building. So let's jump back into Max. Again, I want to check what texture that is using because that color is incorrect. I want to make sure it's more of a red color. So we're just finding out what textures it's using. It's using two different textures actually. So wood post pillar and a wood pillar top. Alright. Let's open those up in Photoshop. So wood post pillar and wood pillar top. So wood pillar top and wood post pillar, they're the two that we want. Alright, again, these textures are quite small. You can see this one's only 64 pixels wide by 256 high. Basically, these textures are quite small, and I'm not going to make them larger because this one's 128 by 256. Because they're really, that piece of geometry we're texturing up here is quite small. It sits at the very top of the ceiling. So you're never going to, even if you're running through it in your game engine in first person, you're never going to be able to get close enough to the top of that ceiling there to see it up close. So you can afford to make sure those textures that are out of reach of your character whenever you're running through your level, if they're completely out of the reach of the character, so they're way up on the ceiling, you can use a lower resolution texture to save on memory in your game engine, because your character will never get close enough to it to see that it's that low res. Does that make sense? So for any of these assets that you're never going to be able to get really close to with your character in your engine, in your game, you can make sure those assets are lower poly. Not lower poly, but the lower resolution textures. And that'll save on some texture memory. And again, this is a small piece of geometry that's way up on the ceiling, so we can use a very small texture resolution. Let's check first to make sure, and this one I know is, the verts are not going to be welded because it's a mesh. Remember guys, I always suggest you work in edit poly, so we're going to convert it to an edit poly. And I know if I, might not be too bad. I thought the verts were split, but I don't think they are actually. Actually they are. You can see here when I select the front it doesn't select the sides, so what we're going to do is we're going to go into vertex mode, select all of our verts, make sure I have ignore backbasing turned off in max here, otherwise when I select them from the front it won't select the ones at the back, and having it turned off make sure it selects everything. we're going to open up our weld dialog here. I'm just going to move it off to the side. And I'm going to push that up. We'll start at 0.41 and work our way back. 0.41. I know from experience of doing the other assets that will work okay for us. Time to sleep, Nano? No, prob 3 AM in France. Ooh. Thanks for popping in and saying hello, Nano. And have a good night's sleep. We'll be back on again tomorrow. If I don't see you tomorrow, hope you have a good Easter. So we've welded our verts together here, and 0.41 should work okay. We can double check that by going into sub-object mode again. And now you see when I select that front face, it also selects the side edges, which is what we want. That means it's welded those together correctly. The reason we want to weld them together is if we didn't do that, when we brought this asset into the Unreal Engine, it's not going to light correctly. You're going to get light leaking into the back edge, and that's going to make the model look strange. So if your model isn't lighting correctly, it's usually one of two things. It's either that your verts aren't welded together, so light is leaking behind the model face, or your normals aren't correct. So yeah, if you're ever having a problem with shadowing and shading happening on your model that you import into Unreal, it's usually because the verts aren't welded or your normals are off in some way. So we've welded our assets together. We're going to change the texture color. But before we do that, guys, I'm just going to take a quick break for a few minutes. I want to freshen up my coffee. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. I'll leave you with my be right back screen while I grab a fresh coffee, and I will see you in just a few minutes, guys. Okay. So we have to change the color of this asset to better match that cherrywood red color we were using on the other assets. Again, because we want to keep everything nice and consistent. So let's jump into Photoshop. I'm going to tile my workspace here. We'll tile it vertically. Okay. I'm doing this so I can see the original red color that we need to try and match here. So we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to start by duplicating the layer. And we're going to do a color correction. So image, adjustment, color correction, color balance, I should say. We'll start by pulling up on the red, pulling back on the yellow, and pulling up on the magenta a little bit. Jump into our shadows. We'll do the same thing again, up on the red, back a bit on the yellow, and a little bit in the magenta. Be careful with the magenta. You don't want to pull it up too much in magenta. And into highlights, up on the red, a little bit back on the yellow. I'm going to pull back a little on the magenta. Just comparing these two colors here now. So from our original yellow to more of a red. Let's jump into our second texture we're using here for that asset. We're going to do the same thing again. We're going to duplicate the layer. And we're going to go into our color correction, color balance, and pull up on the red, pull back on the yellow, pull up a little bit on the magenta. So up on the red, down on the yellow, and just a little bit on the magenta. Now we may have to desaturate these, but before we do that, we'll save them out and bring them into the engine. So save as. We're going to be saving it again as a PNG. Wood pillar top, we can leave it called that. I'm just going to get rid of the underscore text at the end. And we'll save this one out. Again as a PNG. And wood post pillar, we'll keep it the name the same there as well. I'm going to jump back into Max, back into my material editor. I'm just going to swap out those two textures for the two that we just color corrected. So wood post pillar. And wood pillar top. I do this just so I know when I open Max up again that I've already corrected those textures. Alright, let's export this model piece. We're going to call this one, what do we call this one? We'll call it Wood Deco for separator. We're going to reset the export. Collapse that stack, and we're going to export selected. Make sure we create a new folder so everything is organized, and we'll call it Wood Deco Separate. Okay, let's jump into Unreal. Let's import that mesh we just exported from Max. And again, we're just going to give the engine a minute to compile the shaders here. There we go. And the first thing I'm checking for is to make sure my lighting looks correct, and that's fine. So my normals are correct. Before I do any adjustments to the textures here, because we have to create a normal map and an ambient occlusion map for those two textures, I'm just going to drag that asset into the level here. Again, it's looking a little light because we don't have our normal or ambient occlusion on it yet. Just going to rotate our asset a bit. There we go. And what I'm doing here again is I'm checking the color to make sure that the color looks correct next to the asset here, and it does. So now what we can do is we can jump back into Nulled, load up one of the first color maps, because remember that asset uses two different textures, so we're going to have to create normals and occlusions for two textures here. We'll start with the wood pillar top. I'm not going to load in my mesh. I could, but you're going to, because it's using two separate textures, the mesh is going to look a bit funky. I'll show you what I mean. If I load up my mesh now, Wood Deco Sep. Well, what you're finding is it's not using the correct texture here in the background. It's using the correct texture for these square pieces, which is okay. We can work with that. But just do bear in mind, if the FBX is a multi-material, Null works on one texture at a time, so you won't see the multiple materials. Generally what will happen is your mesh will look really weird and the second material will look very strange. Not so noticeable on this, but on some meshes it really will be. Let's just pull back here a bit and make some adjustments now to our normal map. Before we do that, let's make sure we set our path. Wood Deco Step, that's the one we want. Okay, now I'm looking at this and I really think that the normal map on this is way too high. You can see it here in the model. So I'm going to pull back on my intensity. I'm going to keep my stair stepping happening here in my extra large, medium and fine detail. But I'm going to pull back on the intensity from 126% here. Remember, pay less attention to the texture in the background, more attention to the texture that's on these square pieces here at the front. And I'm just moving my light around here. And I do that in null by holding down the right mouse button as I move my mouse. That should be okay. I just want enough of the normal map to show through to show a bit of the detailing in here without making it look like everything's wrapped in plastic. So let's update the integrator so that we have our height map and our ambient occlusion. I'm going to pull up a bit on the ambient occlusion here. Again, I'm going to make sure we have our height map, normal map, ambient occlusion and convexity selected, and I'm going to export. Alright, let's load up our second color map for this asset. And it's going to be this wood post pillar. Again, I'll load the mesh up so you can see it. Generally, you don't have to load the mesh, but it just makes working with the normal map easier. But it will look strange because this is a multi-material asset. Where are we? I've lost where I'm working in now. There we go. And again, you can see how it's messed up our texture map here a bit. But it's really so we can see what's going on at the front here. And I shouldn't really have to make any adjustments now. The settings we've set for the first part of the texture should work for the second anyway. But we must make sure we update the integrator. That all looks fine. Let's do an export again. Let's jump back into Unreal. And let's import those textures we just saved in null. So we want the wood pillar top normal, the occlusion, and the wood post pillar normal and occlusion. Okay, let's open up one of the first materials for that asset. And again, we are going to use Control C here to copy and Control V twice to paste that texture sample in. Okay, this is wood pillar top is the one that we're working with here at the moment. So we're going to use the normal map for wood pillar top here. And we're going to use the occlusion map for wood pillar top here. Pipe our normal into our normal and our occlusion into our occlusion. Wait for the games engine here to compile the shader and save it. Okay. Come on. Alright. Now we've got the other texture to do now, which is this one here. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to Control C to copy and Control V twice to paste two more texture samples in. And this one is called wood post pillar. Wood post pillar, this one here for the normal map. And this one here for the occlusion map. Pipe those into occlusion and normal. Wait for the engine to compile the shader and save it. Alright. And that should be good. Again though, we're going to move our materials into our materials folder here. And I'm just going to rename some of these textures. So wood pillar top underscore color, and wood post pillar underscore color, wood pillar top underscore normal. I'm just going to remove the T at the front. The T is placed there automatically by null. You can change that in the preferences if you want. We'll do the same thing here with the occlusion map. So AO for ambient occlusion, remove the T from the beginning. I'm going to do the same thing here. And the same with the ambient occlusion map. Okay, let's move those into our textures folder. Okay, and we just have to underscore MSH for our mesh. And we should be good. Let's save all of that. And jump back into Max. Alright. So what have we got left here? I have a feeling there is another piece of geometry like that, which is longer, which is down here. We should do that while we're here. Again, it's using the same texture, so the texture has already been updated for it. We could by all means use that short piece and duplicate it in the engine to create this longer piece, but because this is not using many polys anyway, and it's just going to be easier to work with as one piece of geometry, I'm not going to do that. But you could create a blueprint by duplicating that small piece 3 times, say, to create a longer piece that way. We'll just export it as one long piece though, just for simplicity's sake. And just, what do we call this one? Wood Deco Sep. We'll call it the same, but we'll make it long. So, Wood Deco Sep LNG for long.